A single confrontation lasting only a few moments changed countless lives forever. What began as an ordinary high school track meet in Frisco, Texas, quickly became one of the most talked about criminal cases in America. The incident ended with 17-year-old Austin Metcalf dead from a stab wound, and fellow teenager Karmelo Anthony facing a murder charge that would eventually place him at the center of a nationwide debate. For months, the case dominated headlines, social media platforms, and news broadcasts. Supporters on both sides passionately argued over what happened during those critical seconds. Was this an act of self-defense? Was it an unnecessary escalation of a simple dispute? And perhaps most importantly, did the jury reach the correct verdict? After hearing testimony from witnesses, reviewing evidence, and listening to arguments from both prosecutors and defense attorneys, a Texas jury ultimately found Karmelo Anthony guilty of murder. The verdict marked the end of a closely watched trial that had captured national attention. Anthony was sentenced to 35 years in prison, a punishment that reflected the seriousness of the conviction and seemingly brought the legal battle to a close. But the story didn't end when the jury left the courtroom. In the days following the conviction, Anthony's legal team moved quickly to challenge the outcome. Rather than accepting the verdict, they signaled their intention to fight it through the appeals process. New attorneys began reviewing trial records, courtroom transcripts, witness testimony, and judicial rulings in search of potential legal errors that could form the foundation of a challenge against the conviction. This latest development has reopened a case that many believed was finally settled. Appeals are not about proving innocence or asking a new jury to reconsider the facts. Instead, appellate attorneys focus on a different question. Did something happen during the trial that may have prevented a fair legal process? Even a conviction supported by substantial evidence can face scrutiny if significant procedural or legal mistakes are discovered. Now, Anthony's legal team is reportedly preparing a strategy aimed at identifying exactly those kinds of issues. Their goal is to convince a higher court that aspects of the trial deserve a second look. Whether that means challenging evidentiary decisions, questioning legal instructions provided to jurors, or raising other procedural concerns remains at the heart of the developing appeal. The announcement of this new legal effort has immediately reignited public discussion. Some believe the appeal is simply a routine legal step with little chance of success. Others argue that every defendant deserves a thorough review of the trial process, especially in a case carrying such significant consequences. As the appeal begins, one major question now hangs over the entire case. Can Karmelo Anthony's legal team find a flaw significant enough to overturn the conviction, reduce the sentence, or even secure a new trial? Or will the courts determine that the original verdict should stand exactly as it was delivered? Tonight, we're taking a closer look at the appeal, the lawyers behind it, the strategy they are reportedly developing, and what could happen next in one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent memory. With the conviction now behind them, Karmelo Anthony's legal team has shifted its focus from the courtroom battle that ended with a guilty verdict to an entirely different kind of fight: the appeals process. For many people, the word appeal creates the impression that a case will simply be retried from the beginning. But that's not how the legal system works. An appeal is not a second trial. There are no new witnesses, no dramatic cross-examinations, and usually no new evidence presented to the court. Instead, appellate attorneys examine the trial itself, searching for legal mistakes that may have affected the outcome. Their job is to ask a critical question: did the defendant receive a fair trial under the law? If the answer is no, an appellate court has the power to intervene. This is why Anthony's lawyers are now reviewing thousands of pages of transcripts, court filings, judicial rulings, and evidence presented during the trial. Every objection, every decision made by the judge, and every instruction given to the jury is being carefully analyzed. According to legal experts, appellate attorneys generally focus on several key areas when challenging a conviction. One of the most common involves jury instructions. Before jurors begin deliberating, the judge provides detailed legal guidance explaining how they should evaluate the evidence and apply the law. If those instructions are found to be inaccurate, incomplete, or potentially misleading, an appellate court may determine that jurors were not given the proper framework to reach their verdict. Because Anthony's defense centered heavily on self-defense, any instructions related to self-defense laws could become an important area of review. The defense may argue that jurors were not adequately guided on how to evaluate Anthony's claim that he feared for his safety during the confrontation. If appellate lawyers believe the jury was not properly instructed on this issue, it could become a central component of their strategy. Another potential focus involves evidentiary rulings. During every trial, judges decide what evidence jurors are allowed to see and hear. Some evidence may be admitted, while other evidence may be excluded based on legal standards. Defense attorneys often challenge these decisions on appeal if they believe certain evidence should never have reached the jury, or if evidence favorable to the defense was improperly limited. Even a single evidentiary ruling can become significant if appellate judges conclude that it may have influenced the jury's decision-making process. Witness testimony may also receive intense scrutiny. Throughout the trial, jurors heard differing accounts of what happened during the confrontation. Appellate attorneys may review whether certain testimony should have been admitted, whether objections were properly handled, and whether legal procedures were followed during witness examinations. However, it's important to understand that appellate courts rarely reevaluate witness credibility. They generally defer to the jury's findings unless a clear legal error occurred during the presentation of testimony. Another possible avenue involves prosecutorial conduct. Defense teams sometimes argue that statements made by prosecutors during opening statements or closing arguments crossed legal boundaries and unfairly influenced jurors. Appellate courts take such allegations seriously, but they also set a high bar for overturning convictions based on prosecutorial behavior alone. Anthony's legal team may also examine whether any constitutional rights were affected during the investigation, arrest, or trial process. Cases involving due process concerns often receive close attention from appellate judges because constitutional protections are considered fundamental to the justice system. Yet identifying a potential issue is only the beginning. The defense must go further and demonstrate that any alleged error was significant enough to affect the outcome of the trial. This is where many appeals face their greatest challenge. Not every mistake results in a new trial. Courts frequently distinguish between harmless errors and prejudicial errors. A harmless error is a mistake that likely had little impact on the verdict. A prejudicial error, on the other hand, is one that may have influenced the jury's decision in a meaningful way. To succeed, Anthony's attorneys will likely need to convince appellate judges that any errors they identify were not merely technical issues, but serious problems that undermine the fairness of the proceedings. This explains why appeals can take months, or even years, to resolve. Every aspect of the trial must be reviewed, analyzed, and argued before appellate judges who were not present during the original proceedings. These judges will examine the record carefully before deciding whether the conviction should stand. For now, the defense appears to be building its case around the idea that important legal questions remain unanswered. The strategy is no longer focused on persuading a jury. Instead, it is aimed at persuading appellate judges that certain aspects of the trial deserve a second look. And if those judges agree, the consequences could be enormous. potentially opening the door to a new trial, a modified sentence, or another major development in a case that continues to capture national attention. As Karmelo Anthony's appeal moves forward, one question has become increasingly important. What exactly does the defense believe went wrong during the trial? Appeals are rarely built on a single argument. Instead, they are often constructed like a puzzle, with attorneys examining every stage of the case to identify multiple issues that, when viewed together, may persuade an appellate court that the conviction deserves further review. For Anthony's legal team, the strategy appears to center on the belief that significant legal questions remain unresolved and that the jury may not have been given the full opportunity to consider the defense's interpretation of events. To understand their approach, it's important to remember the foundation of Anthony's defense from the very beginning. The defense never denied that Anthony stabbed Austin Metcalf. That fact was not the central dispute during the trial. Instead, the legal battle focused on why the stabbing occurred and whether Anthony's actions were legally justified under Texas law. Throughout the proceedings, defense attorneys argued that Anthony acted in self-defense during a rapidly escalating confrontation. They maintained that he believed he was in danger and reacted to what he perceived as an immediate threat. The jury ultimately rejected that argument and returned a guilty verdict. Now, appellate lawyers are reportedly examining whether jurors were able to fully and fairly evaluate that claim. One area likely receiving intense attention is how self-defense was presented throughout the trial. The defense may argue that certain rulings, limitations, or legal instructions prevented jurors from fully considering evidence that supported Anthony's state of mind during the confrontation. Appellate attorneys often focus on whether the jury received a complete legal framework for evaluating self-defense claims, especially in cases where the entire defense strategy depended on that issue. If appellate lawyers believe that jurors were not adequately equipped to assess the self-defense argument, they could present that concern as a major reason the conviction should be reviewed. Another aspect of the strategy may involve the interpretation of evidence itself. Trials often involve competing narratives. Prosecutors present a version of events that supports guilt, while defense attorneys offer an alternative explanation that supports innocence or legal justification. Jurors must decide which version they find more convincing. Anthony's appellate team may argue that certain evidence was interpreted in a manner that unfairly favored the prosecution, or that key information beneficial to the defense did not receive the consideration it deserved. This does not mean the defense is simply disagreeing with the jury's conclusion. Rather, appellate lawyers may contend that legal decisions made during the trial affected how jurors viewed critical evidence. Witness testimony is another area where the defense may see opportunities to challenge the verdict. During the trial, jurors heard accounts from individuals who witnessed portions of the confrontation. As with many high-profile criminal cases, some details became the subject of disagreement and interpretation. Appellate attorneys are likely reviewing every witness examination, every objection, and every judicial ruling connected to testimony. Their goal is to determine whether any legal errors occurred that may have influenced how jurors evaluated the evidence. The defense may also focus on moments when objections were sustained or overruled, seeking to identify instances where they believe the trial court made incorrect legal decisions. But perhaps the most significant part of the strategy involves shifting the focus away from the emotional aspects of the case and toward the legal standards that govern criminal trials. Appellate courts do not decide whether they personally agree with the jury's verdict. Instead, they examine whether the trial was conducted fairly and according to the law. This distinction is critical. Anthony's lawyers do not necessarily need to convince appellate judges that he should have been acquitted. They must convince them that legal errors may have occurred that affected the integrity of the proceedings. That is a much narrower, but potentially powerful, argument. The defense also understands that appeals are often won through detailed legal analysis rather than dramatic revelations. Unlike television courtroom dramas, successful appeals usually result from carefully documented procedural issues, constitutional concerns, or judicial decisions that appellate courts conclude were improper. This is why Anthony's legal team is reportedly conducting an exhaustive review of the trial record. Every transcript, motion, objection, evidentiary ruling, and jury instruction could become part of the broader argument they are building. Legal experts note that this approach is standard in serious criminal appeals. Attorneys frequently cast a wide net at the beginning of the process, identifying every possible issue before narrowing their focus to the arguments they believe have the strongest chance of success. Still, challenging a conviction is never easy. The defense faces a significant hurdle because appellate courts generally give substantial deference to jury verdicts. Judges are often reluctant to overturn decisions reached after a full trial unless there is clear evidence that legal mistakes affected the outcome. That reality means Anthony's attorneys must do more than identify potential errors. They must persuade appellate judges that those errors were serious enough to undermine confidence in the verdict itself. Whether they can accomplish that remains one of the biggest unanswered questions in the case. For supporters of Anthony, the appeal represents an opportunity to revisit issues they believe were not adequately addressed during the trial. For others, the appeal is simply a routine legal process that is unlikely to alter the outcome. But regardless of where public opinion falls, one thing is clear. The defense has begun laying the foundation for what could become a lengthy legal battle. One aimed at convincing higher courts that the case deserves another look, and that the story of Karmelo Anthony's conviction may not be over just yet. While Karmelo Anthony's legal team prepares its appeal, prosecutors are expected to take a very different view of the case. From their perspective, the trial has already answered the most important questions. The jury heard testimony from witnesses, reviewed evidence, listened to both sides of the argument, and ultimately reached a verdict after weighing all the facts presented in court. To prosecutors, that verdict represents the conclusion of a fair legal process rather than the beginning of a new debate. As the appeal moves forward, the prosecution's likely strategy will be straightforward: defend the conviction and argue that the trial was conducted properly under the law. In appellate cases, prosecutors are not required to prove the defendant's guilt all over again. Instead, they focus on defending the trial record. Their task is to show that the judge made appropriate legal decisions, that jurors received correct instructions, and that any alleged errors raised by the defense either did not occur or had no meaningful impact on the outcome. This is a powerful position because appellate courts generally begin with the assumption that the original verdict is valid. In other words, the defense enters the appeal process carrying the burden of demonstrating that something significant went wrong. The prosecution, meanwhile, can argue that the existing conviction should remain in place unless compelling evidence suggests otherwise. This legal reality creates one of the biggest obstacles facing Anthony's attorneys. Many people are surprised to learn how difficult it is to overturn a criminal conviction on appeal. Appellate courts do not function as second juries. They are not tasked with deciding whether they would have reached the same verdict. Their role is much narrower. They review the legal procedures used during the trial and determine whether any mistakes were serious enough to affect the fairness of the proceedings. That distinction matters because even if appellate judges identify minor errors, they may still allow the conviction to stand. Courts frequently apply what is known as the harmless error doctrine. Under this principle, A conviction will not be overturned simply because a mistake occurred. The defense must show that the alleged error likely influenced the jury's decision or undermined confidence in the verdict. For Anthony's legal team, this means identifying not only potential errors, but also proving that those errors mattered. That is often the most difficult part of any appeal. Consider jury instructions as an example. Even if appellate attorneys argue that a particular instruction could have been worded differently, prosecutors may respond that the overall instructions accurately reflected Texas law and provided jurors with the guidance they needed. Similarly, if the defense challenges an evidentiary ruling, prosecutors may argue that the jury heard overwhelming evidence supporting the conviction regardless of that specific issue. These are the types of arguments appellate courts hear every day. The prosecution is also likely to emphasize the importance of respecting jury decisions. The American legal system places tremendous weight on the role of jurors because they are the individuals who directly observe witness testimony, evaluate credibility, and review evidence firsthand. Appellate judges, by contrast, review written records long after the trial has ended. Because of this, higher courts are often reluctant to second-guess juries unless a clear legal problem is identified. This principle has shaped countless appeals throughout American legal history. Many defendants have entered the appellate process hopeful that higher courts would reverse their convictions, only to discover that appellate standards are far stricter than they expected. Statistics consistently show that the vast majority of criminal appeals do not result in convictions being overturned. That doesn't mean successful appeals never happen. There have been cases where appellate courts found serious constitutional violations, improper jury instructions, prosecutorial misconduct, or evidentiary errors significant enough to justify a new trial. When that occurs, convictions can be reversed, sentences can be modified, or cases can be sent back to lower courts for further proceedings. However, those outcomes typically require substantial legal findings rather than simple disagreements over the evidence. This is the challenge Anthony's legal team now faces. They are not just battling the prosecution. They are battling the legal standards that govern every appeal. Every argument must survive careful scrutiny from appellate judges who will examine whether the alleged errors were preserved during trial, whether they were properly raised, and whether they had a meaningful effect on the verdict. The prosecution is expected to argue that the answer to those questions is no. They will likely maintain that the trial was conducted fairly, that the jury carefully considered the evidence, and that the conviction should remain exactly as it stands today. As a result, the road ahead for the defense is steep. The appeal process may take months or even years to fully unfold. During that time, both sides will present detailed legal arguments. Appellate judges will review the record, and every aspect of the trial will be examined through a legal lens. But despite the challenges, the appeal ensures that the case remains far from over. The prosecution believes the verdict was justified. The defense believes important legal questions remain unanswered. And somewhere between those competing positions, appellate judges will ultimately decide whether the conviction stands, whether the sentence changes, or whether one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent years enters an entirely new chapter. That decision could determine not only Karmelo Anthony's future, but also how this controversial case is remembered for years to come. As the appeal process begins, the question that has followed this case from the very beginning remains unanswered. Is the legal battle truly over, or is another major chapter about to unfold? For now, Karmelo Anthony's conviction remains in place. The guilty verdict stands, the sentence remains active, and the presumption under the law is that the trial was conducted properly unless an appellate court determines otherwise. But appeals are often slow-moving legal battles. Unlike a trial, Where dramatic testimony and courtroom confrontations can unfold over days or weeks, appellate cases frequently take months, and sometimes years, to reach a final conclusion. Attorneys must prepare detailed legal briefs, prosecutors must respond, and appellate judges must carefully review thousands of pages of records before issuing a decision. This means that while the public conversation may move on to other stories, the legal fight itself is only beginning. Over the coming months, Anthony's legal team will likely submit a comprehensive appeal outlining every argument they believe warrants review. Prosecutors will then have an opportunity to respond, defending both the trial process and the jury's verdict. Once those filings are complete, appellate judges will begin evaluating the case. Several outcomes are possible. The most straightforward outcome is that the appellate court upholds the conviction entirely. If that happens, the court would essentially conclude that the trial was conducted fairly and that any issues raised by the defense do not justify reversing the verdict. In that scenario, Anthony's conviction and sentence would remain unchanged. However, that is not the only possibility. The appellate court could determine that a specific legal error occurred, but that it affects only part of the case. In some circumstances, that could lead to a modified sentence or additional proceedings in a lower court. A more dramatic outcome would occur if appellate judges find that a significant legal error affected the fairness of the trial itself. If that were to happen, the court could order a new trial. Such a decision would not automatically mean Anthony is innocent. Instead, it would mean the court believes the original proceedings contained a serious enough issue that the case should be heard again under corrected legal conditions. There is also the possibility that the appeal could continue beyond the first appellate court. If either side disagrees with the initial ruling, additional appeals may be pursued, potentially extending the legal process even further. This is why major criminal cases often remain active long after the original verdict is announced. Yet beyond the legal arguments, court filings, and judicial decisions, there is a human side to this story that should never be forgotten. At the center of this case are two families whose lives were changed forever. For the family of Austin Metcalf, the appeal may reopen painful memories surrounding a loss that can never truly be undone. For the family of Karmelo Anthony, the appeal represents a final opportunity to challenge a conviction that will shape his future for decades to come. No appellate ruling can erase the tragedy that brought this case into the national spotlight. What remains uncertain is how history will ultimately remember it. Will the conviction stand as the final chapter? Will the appellate courts identify issues that require further legal action? Or will new developments emerge that change the course of the case once again? Those answers will only come with time. What is certain is that one brief confrontation at a Texas track meet has evolved into one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent memory, a case that continues to generate debate about self-defense, justice, accountability, and the American legal system itself. As we wait for the next stage of the appeal process, the nation will be watching closely. And now we'd like to hear from you. Do you believe the appeal will have any impact on the outcome of the case? Do you think the conviction will stand, or could the defense uncover legal issues significant enough to change the future of this case? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this update informative, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future developments as this story continues to unfold. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next update.